So, in a world where these two universes collide, who would win? The Flood or the Orks? Well, let's go over the logistics and let's see. So first up, a brief description of both factions in case you're not familiar with either one, or just one. So, if you haven't played Halo or you've never even seen Halo, what are the Flood? So the Flood is simply a parasitic life form that infects any species. It doesn't matter. It will infect anything. In the video games and in the books, they say that the thing that it infects, it must have substantial amount of matter. In other words, it has to be big enough to be infected. But it can still infect small animals. The only thing is, though, is it can't really use those animals. So in other words, it can't use them as zombies because they're not really effective. Especially since the infection forms, which are those tiny little balloon things, are actually too big. They're about as big as a fucking rodent. They're as big as a cat. So infecting dogs and cats is not really viable. They need to infect something big, like a dolphin, a human, anything. Anything that's substantial. Now, what makes the Flood very interesting is that when they gather up enough corpses, essentially, or enough hosts, they can actually combine and make a giant mind. I'm not joking. They can actually combine into one big superstructure, one big organ, technically, and that organ now is a hive mind. So now all of the Flood hosts are now linked together. Besides this, though, the Flood do operate also on a molecular level. They can actually change the environment. They can actually release spores into the air that can infect you. This is where the Flood become very dangerous, is that not only when they infect you do they take over your body, but they also learn all the things that you learned. They may not have feelings. So in other words, they may not hold the same passion that you had for a woman in high school, but they do know how to drive a car. They do know how to operate a gun. They do know how to fly a ship. They do know how to work it. And this is where the Flood gets extremely dangerous. So, now let's talk about the Orks. Now, the Orks are part of Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy. Now, the Orks are a half animal, half fungoid production. Essentially, they reproduce through spores. Oh boy. So essentially, the moment that they reach a planet, they automatically start reproducing, and it's no hindrance to them. They don't need to have sex. They don't even have sexual organs. So they kind of infect the planet that they're on. Now, do they change the environment to their liking? Not really. The only way they change the environment is through normal deforestation by just cutting down trees a lot and causing mass explosions and fires. But besides that, let's talk about the orc physiology, since that's the more important part. How are they as far as stature and combat? Well, orcs are extremely tough. Now, a normal orc boy is usually around 6 feet tall, and that's not the limit. The biggest orcs we've ever seen are literally the size of gargants, which is about the size of a giant tower. Now, their weapons and technology can range from sticks and rocks all the way up to literally black hole guns. Guns that could just make black holes. Yep, nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. Their power scale is pretty infinite, just like the Flood. Now, the thing is, though, about the orcs is that they have very low intelligence. So, in other words, when they see a big enemy, they don't think, oh shit, I shouldn't fuck with that, like the Flood would. Instead, they think, oh, that's going to be a good fight, that is. And he's going to charge in and probably get killed. This is more or less the way the orc culture is. They love to fight. They're bred for it. They love it. Now, as far as their physiology, their head is actually right where their chest is. It's mostly because their spine curves. And this is where I would actually say this gives them an advantage. But besides that, their nervous system isn't really that complex. It's actually very simple. So an orc may not be able to have the fine finger movements to play a bagpipe, or the fine finger movements to be able to pinch something. But that's not exactly a problem for the orc society because they don't need to make delicate movements. They could just make a closed fist, deck someone in the head long and hard enough to, just crush their skull, and that's good enough for the orcs. And that's also the last factor. Orcs are extremely strong and durable. So when it comes to, burning them out, they can actually survive this. Even the spores that they exhibit could survive a fire. This, again, is going to play a big role in the versus category. The flood spores are tough, but they are able to be easily swept aside with a brief fire, a brief cleansing. The orc spores, on the other hand, you have to really burn the atmosphere in order to get rid of the spores. So, besides that, let's get into the verses. The first category, how are they at their weakest? Now, at their weakest, this would be essentially the micro scale. So we're talking about the flood spores versus the orc spores. Now, the difference between the two is that a flood spore doesn't turn into a full combat form or infection form. It's not capable of that. It's only meant to infect. Now, a orc spore is just simply going to burrow into the ground, and after a few days, it's going to go and grow ahead into a full-fledged orc. Or it could grow into a squig, it could grow into anything. But typically, it's an orc. So, already we have a bit of a difference here. Now, thankfully, Warhammer 40k has some books on this, but there is a faction very similar to the Flood called the Tyranids. They pretty much operate the same. The only difference is that Tyranids aren't a parasite. They are instead an actual threat to all living things because they just consume. Now, with the Tyranid spores, what happens is the Tyranid spores change the environment, turning everything into fleshy organs that just digest and suck up all the nutrients out of a world. Well, the flood spores there in this situation, what happens is the Tyranid spores try their best to dissolve the cells of these spores. But it becomes a battle of resistance versus the good old-fashioned just break an egg. In other words, when it comes to the flood fighting the orc spores, the flood spores aren't going to have any capabilities of dissolving matter. This isn't what the flood spores are meant for. So the orc spores are going to be able to land freely into the dirt and grow into orcs. This is not good for the orcs because then this means that if the flood knows where those spores are, they can easily just infect them the moment they come out of the ground, not even give them a chance. But this actually works for the orcs at the same time because then that means that the orcs have no hindrance to their reproduction. That means that they can have a high rate of attrition and be totally fine with this. This is normal for them. They love high attrition. Now let's look on one scale above this. What about one single infection form, which is those tiny little ball things? They're easy to kill, very kind of helpless, but they do have some bit of cunning to them. Sometimes they're able to walk on the ceiling, sometimes they hide behind a corner before they latch out on you. More commonly in the video games, they just kind of run at you mindlessly like dumbasses. But in the books, they do kind of exhibit a bit of sentience. Like they understand, oh, okay, I'm weak. I should probably hide. But if they're in groups, like that one picture I put up for you, they will swarm you. They don't care how many they lose. They will swarm you and eventually you will fall. Now, for an orc boy who is feral, so in other words, he doesn't have any technology, he just has a stick, he is going to have some issues with this. Because he's open to infection, he can easily just inhale a spore and boom, he becomes infected. Or, since he has no real armor to protect himself, it's easy for something that's got low cunning to latch onto him and just burrow into his chest. This is where it becomes difficult. So it depends on the orc boy. Personally, to me, I think the orc boy is at a severe disadvantage to the point that he would probably lose most of the time. So every time an orc sees it, he'll swing it and crush it. Great. But the issue becomes is how many infection forms are we talking here? Because usually there's not one. There's a lot. But let's just say you dropped one orc and one infection form, and there is no trees, no corners, no nothing. They're just in one room together. The orc is going to easily win. He's going to whoop its fucking ass. He's going to smack the thing aside and then start crushing it. The issue becomes, is he going to eat it? Because orcs aren't that smart. Now, mind you, the orcs won't understand that this thing is a infection, a parasite. Even on the molecular level, it will infect you. Orcs don't understand that, especially feral orcs. So the issue becomes, if he's in an open environment, easily sees it, easily kills it, he might eat it and still get infected. This is bad for him. This is bad for everybody. But if there is a lot of foliage, if there's a lot of jungle canopies, if there's maybe a dense urban environment and the orc just kind of wandered into a city, yeah, he might actually get fucked by this infection form really easily. Especially since they could just jump down from the ceiling and latch onto his spine, which is the main way they infect you. So, let's go on to the next stage. What about in a mid-scale level? So what happens when the orcs have a society, they have machine guns, they have a few vehicles, but they're not that advanced. They don't have really like laser guns, they don't have massive weapons of destruction. And what happens when the flood is equally on par with that? So they have like a young proto-Gravemind. So they're able to somewhat coordinate what's going on. They have a few infection forms at their disposal. They have a lot of the tiny little shits running around. So what happens then? This is where it gets interesting. So as I said before with the spores, it depends on that situation. Now, the Gravemind gets more and more smart the more and more bodies it has. The bigger the Gravemind gets, the smarter it gets. Likewise with the orcs, the more orcs there are, the more the scale of warfare escalates, the smarter they get, and the stronger they get, and the tougher they get. So this is where it gets really interesting. So you have the flood on one hand. The more the war escalates means that the more bodies they have, and that means that they get more intelligent. But they do not get more stronger. They do not get more tougher. But their intelligence multiplies. So in other words, when the orcs get smarter, they only get smarter by a smidgen. But when the flood gets smarter, they get smarter by multiples. They get smarter exponentially. They just keep increasing and increasing and increasing. Now, the fact that the orcs get stronger and tougher is actually a good thing for them. That means that not only do the flood spores have to break through their armor, which is kind of a hassle, especially if he has hard, dense, 3-inch metal plate armor just sitting on his chest, because that's probably what the orcs would start developing if they get used to this combat. They'll just start having thick-ass plates of metal on their chest, and they'll probably start wearing rebreathers, because that's what orcs do. They eventually adapt to what they're fighting against. This is what they were made for. Then what happens is that the flood's going to start losing. But every time the flood does infect that orc, now it has an orc who's actually tougher than the other dead orcs that it has at its disposal. Now, as the orcs increase exponentially, so does the flood. This is where it could get into a stalemate. Now let's get into the last stage. This is where I consider the uber stage. What if you take both factions at their strongest? What could happen? Alright, this is where it gets a little screwy. So the orcs don't have a limit. Neither do the flood. But we do know the flood when they have reached a certain pinnacle where they're just unstoppable. And we do know when the orcs reach this limit. But they also face two different adversities. So the flood, when they get super, super advanced and they've invaded hundreds of worlds, they eventually form these things called key worlds. And these worlds are essentially just massive grave mines. That's all they are. Just one big mind. And this mind can actually do a lot of things. It can manipulate the very fabrics of slip space. So that means that they can choose when or where your ships are going to pop out of nowhere. They can choose to make it difficult for your ships to navigate through space. They can even hack technology on a molecular scale for whatever reason. I'm not joking. In the Mona Lisa book, a small grave mine was starting to form on a ship, and the way the flood interact with technology is different. They don't infect a human, and then all of a sudden you see that zombie start typing on a keyboard to make a ship move. No. Instead what happens is they spread their organ-like systems all over the keyboard. They spread their organs all over the engine itself. They don't need a computer anymore. They don't need a keyboard to tell the engine what to do. Instead, through a molecular radiance that they exhibit, they can actually manipulate technology that way. Through their supreme mind powers, they actually have an aura of effect on technology. This is a big issue for the Halo universe Because in real life and in Halo, a lot of defense systems are automated. They're run by AIs. Well, if the Flood can just simply infect your AIs before their ships even came into your range, that's a big issue. Now 99% of your defenses are fucking gone. Because they're corrupted. The technology got ruined by this radiance that these key worlds can exhibit. Well, the Orks don't have anything like that, thankfully. So in other words, Flood, they are able to infect technology and they're able to destroy AIs before they even show up. This is how strong they can get. This is ridiculously powerful against foes like any normal human faction. Any normal alien world would get fucked by this. But the Orks, everything is run by the Orks. Nothing is really automated. This is where it gets very interesting. So the Orks at their highest level, we've seen this. They form literally attack moons. Now, these attack moons are essentially like mini Death Stars, but they don't blow up worlds. They just simply teleport the whole moon anywhere across space. And there's so much raw energy inside these attack moons that they can just pop out instantly. They don't have to worry about warp issues. They don't have to worry about warp storms. They don't have to worry about anything. They just brute force, bam, now they're in this location. Bam, now they're in this location. They just keep teleporting. Now, the issue with teleporting a big-ass moon is that this affects the gravity, this affects the tectonic plates of any planet it comes into orbit with. So in other words, the Orks can cause utter devastation before the Orks even get off the moon to begin with. This is a big issue for the defenders. This means that, boom, here comes this massive moon. All of a sudden, you have massive earthquakes, massive floods, massive hurricanes popping out of fucking nowhere, all because the gravity just got totally changed by this huge object just popping out of nowhere. This means that buildings and infrastructure are fucking ruined at the foundation level, so now the whole towers are fucked. So there's both kind of similar in the sense that the Orks and the Flood can destroy your world, your defenses at least, before they even begin their invasion at this uber level. But let's get a little further. The attack forms of the Flood start to mutate. So this is where we start seeing true Flood forms, pure forms. Pure forms take a few years to assemble. But as we've seen in Halo Wars 2, the Nightmare DLC, we see that some of these forms are specialized in restraining their opponents to make it easier to infect them. Literally, we see it where one brute is restrained by these tentacles. That way, he's just open, bare-chested, ready to get implanted with some parasite. This is extremely deadly. Then we also see it where the Flood can just manifest tentacles out of the ground to swipe your car out of the alleyway and just pick up troops and just throw them into the sky. This is pretty scary, especially since those tentacles have to require heavy ordnance to destroy. You need tanks to destroy those tentacles. This is very scary. The Orks, on the other hand, they're so technologically advanced that their scouting force can range in the millions, and each individual Ork is so technologically advanced that all of them are wearing power armor. Now, power armor is different in Halo than it is in Warhammer 40k. In Warhammer 40k, power armor is just armor that has electricity running through it. So it doesn't have shields. It just is really big and bulky and just enhances the user. This is extremely important because now the Orks definitely have a good 3 inches or more of steel plating, of whatever metal plating, that's going to make it harder for the Flood to infect. More importantly, the Flood cannot actually infect their technology. So in other words, they can't just turn off your sight scope for your sniper rifle. They can't do that because the Orks don't work technologically like that. Instead, they work on belief. So all their engineering skills is bullshit. They're literally just bullshitting it 100%. So since they run everything by belief, like in other words, they'll fire a rocket at you that has no gunpowder in it. So how the fuck is it flying towards you? No idea. It's all about belief. The Flood, on the other hand, can make it extremely difficult for other species, but not difficult for the Orks. And this is where I would say at an uber level, the orcs win, hands down. All of them have power armor. All of them are just super ridiculously amazing. These attack moons can literally shift the tectonic plates of a world that they invade. This means that flood worlds would stand no fucking chance. Also, we have to factor in that orcs, even when they're not at this uber level, have invaded demon worlds. This is really crazy. They've invaded fucking demons and destroyed them and sent them back to wherever the hell they've came from. They've literally taken a world out of hell. This is something I don't see the Flood ever able to do. Against other factions in Warhammer 40k, I think they would totally win. The Tau, they would crush them. The Imperium, they might actually win. But the Orcs, no. The Orcs are too powerful. Essentially, they scale infinitely. The Flood scales infinitely, but they scale infinitely against technological factions. The Orcs, they aren't that technologically inclined. They may increase their technology, but their technology doesn't work based on science. It works based on belief. This is a huge, huge factor in the determination of their uber levels. How does their technology work? Because having power armor is great, but if your shields just turn off because some magical mind just turns it off with his radiance of molecular spores, it's useless. But even orcs in modern day Warhammer 40k who aren't at the super level literally burn worlds. They already destroy Tyranids, which are almost the same, if not worse, than the Flood. And make it even better, there's actually an orc clan called the Snakebites, and they're more or less adhering to the feral orc philosophy. So they can fly ships, they just choose not to. They rather just live as weird feral orcs. And they've actually made it where they actually colonize Tyranid spores and purposely let them loose on a world just so that way once the Tyranid invasion reaches its full growth, they have something to fight. I could see this with the orcs, where they could fight a whole world of the Flood and keep a few of the infection forms alive just to release them onto another opponent. So that way once they kill their opponent, boom, there's a new Flood infection for them to fight. This is the only way I could ever see the Flood being used by the Orc Society. As far as the Flood, how could they stand a chance? I think they could stand a chance at the beginning, but maybe in the middle, but not at the end. Because in the middle phase, they can at least find out caves that these new orcs are being grown and bred from, and they can easily just infect the fuck out of it. Just keep infecting these newborn orcs, and then swarm the bigger orcs who are combat veteran, very experienced. Yeah, just swarm them with a bunch of useless small orc boys. Yeah, you'd probably win. But when it comes to a bigger macro scale, no. Unfortunately, no. It's going to have to be a solid Rogaldorn. No. So besides that, I hope you guys enjoyed. What do you guys think about this? I hope you guys enjoyed it. And maybe you guys agree with me, maybe you guys don't. But besides that, this has been Freezer700. I'm out. See you guys next time. And comment down below what you guys think. Maybe you want to see something new. Maybe you want to see another hentai review. I think the next video is going to be a hentai review. But just let me know.